All right. Well, welcome to everyone that's joining in. Welcome to another 21-minute live event series on Salesforce responsibly. Joining me today is Melanie Fellay, ultra adoption focused trailblazer, CEO of Spekit, and we're picking up on the great conversation from 2 weeks ago on our quest to improve user adoption. And this time, in 21 minutes, we're here to answer 4 key questions. How do you pitch Salesforce to end users? What are common factors that companies that excel at user adoption have between one another? How does one build a habit of using Salesforce day in and day out? And then any advice on getting buy-in as an admin from the executive group to get more out of adoption. So as we begin, Melanie, thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. Really excited about today's topic. This should be fun.
Awesome. Let's jump right in because we only got a couple of minutes to go. How do you pitch Salesforce to end users?
So just by the nature of that question, I think the first piece of it is owning the fact that you, as a Salesforce admin, are an internal salesperson. You are in a sales role within your own company, meaning whether you're a solo admin, whether you're on a team, your number one job is getting people excited about Salesforce. It means working with your executive team, working with the different stakeholders at a management level that are responsible for teams, and obviously working with your end users. So let's talk a little bit about like those different stakeholder groups and like what gets them excited. So when it comes to like, I always like actually taking a bottoms up approach, right? Because the executive team is only going to care once they can see the results that it's working, and that relies on end users actually using it every day. And so I think it's important to take a step back and understand like what impacts an individual's likelihood to actually use technology. And there's not a whole lot of research out there, but there is one really interesting study, and it really breaks it down into two things. One, I will use Salesforce if I think it's going to be useful. In other words, perceived usefulness is the number one factor that influences an individual's likelihood to use Salesforce. And so if you're focusing on the what and the how and not focusing on the why, stop right there, because that's where you're going wrong, right? Before you ask them or show them how to do something, first focus on the benefits. How is this going to help that particular user make more money if they're in sales, serve their customers better if they're in customer support, or whatever else that initiative is, right? So, and in order to come up with that why, you need to spend time with them. So the first thing is, one, sit down with your users. Actually watch them work and get to know their roles and why Salesforce is going to help them and why they're going to care, what's in line for them if they use Salesforce and they get more results. And two, relate every feature, relate every part of Salesforce you're going to show them to that why, to their why. How is it going to make me more money as a salesperson? Because I'm going to be able to track my customers and make sure that I never forget to follow up, right? And so you really want to focus on that communication first and foremost. And the same goes with managers and executives.
Yeah, absolutely. I love what you're saying there because it hits, there's so much to go there, but I can definitely relate to recommending to a lot of people that I've come across to, almost do these unsolicited visits to users because a lot of times when it comes to user adoption, we build things in a certain way and imagine them using them in this way that we've built, but users seem to be very good at finding their own way around it and finding different ways to enter. So there's just so much you can uncover by just walking up to their desk and seeing how they're using the system. Like sometimes you'll just be like, well, once you realize how they're really using it, there's a ton that you can do right there. Yeah. So totally relate to it. Yeah, absolutely. So is there an easy way to pitch this, or is there a go-to that you usually recommend there, or maybe even leading on to the next one? Are there some common factors, right, that a lot of these companies that are doing awesome with user adoption, is there a common trait that they're doing to kind of pitch this, to pitch the use of Salesforce to their users?
It's actually a really good segue because in that same study, one of the other top 3 factors that influences adoption is actually peer influence, right? And that's the whole idea that if your whole family has an iPhone, you're more likely to get an iPhone because you want to have that shiny blue text. If you're on a sales team and the number one AE, the number one rep is absolutely crushing it and using Salesforce every day, the rest of your team is going to be more likely to use Salesforce because they see that person, right? And so the whole idea that psychologically as individuals, we're influenced by others means that as a Salesforce admin, the number one thing you need to do is, yes, you need to sell, but you don't need to be a lone ranger. You don't need to do that alone. And so the best thing you can do for yourself, the best thing I did is by sitting with my users, by actually reaching out to people, to go to coffee, to go to lunch, just be like, hey, I'm really trying to like improve this. Will you just like give me feedback? Like, will you just tell me like what your thoughts are on it? And really soliciting in that time. Not only do you get feedback and identify like areas of Salesforce that actually could be improved, but you start building relationships, right? You start building relationships maybe with your managers, with your end users, and you start building these champions, right? And it's like, oh, wait, this guy mentioned this one report that would be super helpful to him. Let me go out and build it, tell him I built it, and then get him like, hey, by the way, can you tell your friends about it? Can you tell the rest of your team about it? And so the number one thing to keep in mind is like, you as an IT team person do not want to be the person that's really constantly pushing change and driving adoption, because it's going to be harder to get buy-in from the sales team. Instead, find your allies on each of those teams and build a champions board. You can do it in a formal or informal manner. You can do it with incentives or not, right? I always tried to make it fun. I held office hours that people could come to. I do lunch and learns. I'm like, hey guys, like I want to show you how you can pull a report on any of your things. I'm like, bring the enthusiasm, like bring the fun, right? Because like we all know why we love Salesforce. We know the power of Salesforce, right? But part of that is like passing on that enthusiasm to your users. And the best way to do that is A, spend time with them. B, think of different ways that you can engage them other than just sending them an email with like that weekly release. Does that make sense?
That's interesting. No, it makes a ton of sense, but let me build, because there was something that you even said that was kind of interesting too. We were talking a little bit about just building this report on the fly and then having them share with others. And one of the key concepts, I'd love to hear your take on it, was, finding things that are easy pickings, because a lot of times some major changes in adoption or how people perceive it have come from simple automations, right? So do you have any experience with that, or any insights that you can share in terms of like, have you seen like investigations where easy things could be uncovered? Like, do they happen often? Like how do you see that from your experience?
100%. And I can actually think back to specific examples. I used to work in a real estate financial institution. So we used to underwrite deals and sell loans. And so for us, like I was dealing with a user population that had worked out of Outlook and spreadsheets their entire life. They managed their contact book in both Outlook and spreadsheets, and that was it, right? And so getting them to log into Salesforce, and this wasn't an age category thing. I had millennials and I had, people that had been in the workforce for longer. This was strictly just like, that was how they were taught how to do their job, right? And so this was a fundamental shift. And so again, like I literally sat down with them, and there was this one guy, Mark, who was a pain in the butt, excuse my language, in terms of like getting him to use Salesforce, but I needed him to, because he was one of those influencers. He was one of the ones that everyone else looked up to. And I was finally like, Mark, show me right now, if I asked you to do this one thing, like if you wanted to, like, one, show me your day-to-day. When you log in, like who do you figure out who you need to reach out to today? He's like, well, I just like look at the top of my email inbox. I was like, well, what about that meeting you had 2 weeks ago? Don't you wish you could see that? He's like, well, I guess, but like, I don't know how to do that. And so then I started showing him, I was like, well, do you know in Salesforce, if you logged a task, you could come in every day and see tasks? He's like, whoa, really? And then I was like, yeah. And then you can even bulk select and send them an email right there. So you can like reach out to 8 people, and like, you don't even need to write that email individually. You can just pull in the lead name and it'll send 8 emails. He's like, and I don't need to do anything but click a button. I'm like, yeah. He's like, well, what if I want to do this email too? I was like, oh, I can build you a template for that, right? And so actually sitting down and like getting them to see the power, and then identifying like, what are those low hanging fruit? What are those quick wins? In my case, it was an email template. He's like, well, I also want to be able to do this. I was like, no worries. I got you. Let me go build that template. I'll come right back. And like, within a minute, I built the template, and it was a big win. So I think like, again, the number one thing when it comes to adoption, like it's a people thing, right? It's a psychological thing, just like in sales. Like it's less about the product, it's more about the relationship and like them being emotionally bought into it. So the more you can spend time with your users, make it fun, make it something that's really going to help them feel incentivized to use it, the better, in terms of just, creating a culture around it.
Yeah, that's an awesome answer. And I can certainly relate to the email template, because I've seen it enough times. And actually, as recent as I want to say a week and a half ago, I went through that exact situation where, it's like the world has opened, when they found out the power of email templates, and they're like, oh my God, I can send so many more emails now, and this is so simple.
Yeah,
So it's kind of interesting because it sounds silly in many ways, but it's like it changes them, because a lot of times, we're kind of biased from sitting where we are in terms of configuring and doing all these things that may not even seem that impressive. But it's crazy how to them sometimes, if it's not top of mind for them, they're just like they don't even think it's possible, or they're just like, oh yeah, this is how the system was set up, this is how we have to do it. They find ways to work around it, and that's it. They just kind of go to that.
And the big trick there is, I think, like the one thing to be careful of is that most admins, at least in my company, like I was getting all of my requirements from management, right? Either executive team or, line managers that were asking me for like fancy automations, but they were a couple degrees removed from like the email template example, right? They're not thinking, oh, they need this one email template. They're thinking, well, we need to automate the entire lead automation, like they're thinking a lot bigger in scale. And so that's where you start missing some of those low-hanging fruit. And so I think your end users are really going to help you identify like small UI UX things, right? In terms of consistency in page layouts, or like where a button is located, like those tiny little things that again have like make that, 80% you've already built, but that 20% is ultimately what's going to drive 80% of adoption. Like spending time with your end users help you identify those tiny pieces that really make the biggest difference. And then going back to the champions piece, when you do roll that field out, when you do roll that button out, when you do roll that template out, ask that person to email their team, or ask them to lead your lunch and learn session. And it feels a little bit awkward at first, but most of the time they're excited about it, right? It's an opportunity for them to potentially, have a voice in the company. And again, my company was relatively small, it was 150 employees, but it was still a good opportunity to get, other people spreading the word about Salesforce, so that it wasn't just my voice that we're hearing all the time.
That's pretty interesting. And it's kind of interesting because it brings us a good segue here into, question number 3, which is, how does one build a habit, right? Because you can easily build a great tool, but people can fall out of habit if they have different ways, especially if they can default back to like an Excel spreadsheet, which was the solution prior. How can you build a habit, right, of using Salesforce day in and day out?
Yeah, so I'll answer that in a couple different ways. I think the first one, in terms of like for us, when Salesforce became more of a habit, is again, like one of the biggest differences was making more personalized homepages and dashboards, right? Where dashboards were actually driving behavior, in the sense that it wasn't just like a dashboard of reports. Like it was a dashboard of like, here are all the new leads that came in last night that were assigned to you. Here are the contacts that you haven't reached out to, since 2 weeks ago that you need to follow up with. Here are the opportunities that have close dates this week that you need to do something. Here are the tasks that you've set, right? And so once you're able to like really understand, like, what does the day-to-day of each kind of segment of my user base look like, right? I used to manage our operations teams, completely different examples, right? For them, it was, okay, first I need to go through any recent payments that came in. Then I need to go through my delinquent loans. Then I need to go through and send those people notices, right? And so once you actually understand like what the day-to-day of that employee looks like, you're able to create a dashboard that actually helps drive their behavior throughout their day. And so I then like mapped essentially each report in that dashboard to one of their particular workflows. Does that make sense?
It does. And definitely, if you have a screenshot or an example, something like that, I'd love to put it as a link on the, on the YouTube description below. One of the things that I definitely wanted to add into that as well, and this is a summer 20 release thing, because now with flows, you can even track how long flows take to execute the screen flows. So how long people are taking. So if you roll out a feature on a flow, like an enter in an activity or enter in an opportunity, one of the great things that came to mind was the fact that now you can time how long something's taking. So if there's a bottleneck in the process or something people are getting confused on, or just giving up altogether, it's like a really cool feature. It came to mind just kind of as you were explaining, but and you can put that on a dashboard, kind of coming into full circle. But I agree with you. The more you set yourself up to see this, right, what's going well and what's not going, that's crucial, because it gives you the idea of, okay, well, gives you an idea of where to look, right, to continue improving.
And that's actually a really good point. Like there's kind of two types of dashboards. Like one, there's the end user facing one, which I called it was like my day or something was the name of it. And so that was like when they logged in, it was on their homepage. So like that was like really to drive like their behavior. So they didn't need to like go into each object and look at each list view and like see everything. They just had like a home base where like it would drive like essentially their day as they went along it. And then I would create reports based on like new fields that I'd roll out or changes that I'd roll out for myself that would help me track adoption of them. So, there might've been reports that were like, show me every opportunity where this field is blank. Cause there were sometimes like I'd add a field, but I couldn't add like a validation or make it a requirement for whatever reason. And so those help me identify like, here are the records that aren't getting filled out so that I could send reminders. In terms of making it a habit too, like the biggest things there are going to be ease of use and simplicity. Right? If you look at how habit loops are formed, like the science of them, your likelihood to go to the gym is motivated not by going to the gym, but how you want to feel or look afterwards, right? So there needs to be a reward. There needs to be that incentive that actually drives behavior, right? And then there needs to be a cue. There needs to be something that reminds you to use Salesforce. And so that can be either like your workflow, an alert from a customer. It can be an email from your manager to update pipeline, you name it. And then the biggest piece that matters is response time, right? And the whole idea there is that like, if we take a gym, for example, your cue, your trigger is your alarm going off in the morning. But if you know that you need to drive an hour to go to that gym and back, that response time, like that friction in the process is too big for you to actually want to respond to it, right? And so once you understand the habit of like what actually drives human behavior, or once you understand the science behind like what drives human behavior, you're able to apply that to your users and realize like, if I make this process hard to do, or if it adds more steps than what they were doing previously, they're less likely to do it, right? And so that is where like process improvement, constantly like, again, talking to your users, looking at how they do it today, looking at the change you're suggesting, doing UAT, all those things are so, so critical because ultimately, if it's hard, they won't do it, plain and simple. Because an account executive is worried about bringing in their big customers. They're not worried about filling in data for their manager, right? And so the user can do it. And that's a big inspiration perspective is like, how easily can we make it for them to learn? Because if we make it hard for them to learn, they're also not going to do it. Because even if I'm motivated to go in because I think I can make more money if I use Salesforce, or if I think it can better serve my customers, if it's hard for me to learn, if I can't figure out where I need to click, if I can't figure out what I need to do, I'm just going to be turned off by doing it altogether.
Yeah, and one thing I'll definitely add to that from personal experience, one of the most crucial things, and you said response time, and I cannot stress enough how much also response time in delivery is important, because I know of a lot of great examples, and we may want to do videos on it afterwards, on simple exercises that will draw out amazing initiatives that you could do to help improve user adoption. But if you have an end user open up, take the time, dedicate, get involved and invested in sharing things that they'll genuinely think will make Salesforce better, but you don't act on it right away, or you don't at least act on some easy apple picking kind of like, solutions, then they're like, well, I just did this for nothing. And you break that habit so fast. As soon as they kind of flick the switch and kind of say, what's the point? It's just, we're just going to be talking and nothing's going to change. And like, that's important. We're talking about building habits. That's an important note of also not to break habits, right?
Totally. And credibility too, right? At the end of the day, like, you're constantly going to be selling Salesforce. You're constantly going to be selling that next change or that next initiative, or, we're adding Conga, we're adding Casper, and here's why. And like, again, focusing on the why, but building your credibility by knowing that like, yes, when you roll out that feature, you are going to be there to provide support, right? In terms of more tactical, you mentioned like, what are some things, like a few things to keep in mind. Like I used to be a stats state in college. And so I brought the whole concept of office hours to my last company, where after a big rollout and then on a regular basis, just in slightly less frequency, I just have office hours on my calendar. They were just dedicated end user support hours where anyone could come vent, anyone could come get help, etc. And the benefit is that they knew that those hours were on the calendar. And so instead of me getting pinged all day long, which originally I was, with questions on like how to do the same thing for the 20th time, they knew that they could come to that office hour. And I would spread them out, like Monday mornings, maybe like at noon, and then Tuesdays at 9 a.m. so that depending on people's schedules, they could come. But it provided a forum that like helped me as an admin, because that meant less context switching every time I got an end user support question. but they knew that there was a forum for them to come request things, etc. And then like for one of the habits that I developed as an admin is every time I got a question, I'd start making a list. And even if I didn't have time to document it right then, I'd maintain like a note of here are the recent questions that came up. And then when I did find 20 minutes, and if you can't find it, just have 20 minutes 3 times a week on your calendar that are dedicated towards training. Because at the end of the day, if you don't actually put the effort forward in terms of owning the fact that like you are responsible for adoption. Yes, a big piece of your job is actually building things in Salesforce, but what's the point of you building all this fancy stuff if you're not actually thinking about like, how do I support and ensure that the organization gets value because my users know how to use it and have embraced that functionality? And so, you know, making a list of those questions as they come up, because guess what? You're never going to find 3 hours in your day to just spend time documenting. That time just never happens, but just trying to make that piece of it a habit as well on your calendar. Like I realized that part of my job is spending an hour a week dedicated to improving our ongoing training and support.
Yeah. All right. Well, we're coming to the top of it. Just with another minute to go, any good advice on getting buy-in as an admin? Admins can sometimes be low on the totem pole, right? With how much how much they can actually influence change. Do you have any advice like that you could give someone that's watching to say, hey, here's how you can probably convince an executive to kind of back you up on this and become more involved?
Yeah. So I think like it goes back to what I've repeated multiple times, the why, right? And when you're speaking to an executive, it really you need to tie whatever you're doing to one of the top business objectives, right? So whatever organization you work at, every organization has maybe 2 or 3 like vocalized objectives that are geared in the organization. So one, how is whatever thing you're looking for, if you're looking for budget for a new tool, if you're looking to build out functionality and you're asking for like roadmap time, whatever it is, first, how do you tie that project to a top line objective? And then actually break it down in terms of like how mathematically it brings up, right? Going back to the selling piece, you're selling your executive team on the value of what you're doing, right? And so if you're able to say, hey, I think that by implementing Conga, I'm going to be able to save 5 minutes on every document that gets created. And guess what? Each rep that we have creates 5 documents a week. That ROI is there, right? And so I think like as an admin, realizing that the reason I love being an admin is because like your role is so versatile and it is what you make it, right? And once you're able to start having those kind of literate conversations, and if anyone that's listening has questions on like how to have those kinds of conversations, please feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. Happy to work with you around like how to build business cases. That's something that no one taught me, that I had to learn from scratch. And now my team presents me with business cases. We help our admins present business cases to their leadership, but it's all about like, what is the top business objective? How does this project tie back to that? And then how can I like mathematically prove out why this is going to be helpful? And then you start getting leadership attention. So that's where it started.
Yeah, that's an absolute awesome way, I think, to kind of close even our conversation, because we can keep going on it forever. But at the same time, I think this is an awesome conversation. I really think we touched a lot of important and tangible things, because there's a lot of little tidbits here that can definitely be easily applied, right? So we can help improve user adoption. I definitely want to give a big shout out to anyone from the Fort Lauderdale admin community that's here watching this today. And, Melanie, thank you so much. You're more than welcome to come back. We can keep this conversation going, and this was pretty awesome. And just to kind of finalize to everyone, as we said a couple of weeks ago, it's the big Uncle Ben quote: with great power comes great responsibility. So always remember to Salesforce responsibly so you can keep building amazing solutions out there. We're going to keep some more videos coming. We got another one tomorrow with Peter Lyons. We're going to be talking about flows. Until then, thank you, everyone, and we'll see you on the next one.